The village of Zorkino has always been a quiet and secluded place. The inhabitants lived a simple life, avoiding strangers and rarely leaving their homes after sunset. It was said that the village was cursed, and that every morning, when the first ray of sunlight touched the ground, they came out of the forest. No one knew exactly who or what these creatures were, but the stories of the old men were frightening. Some claimed they were shadows of people missing in the woods. Others whispered that they were spirits eager to take someone with them. A young boy named Artyom didn't believe in village tales. He was a city dweller who came to his grandmother's house to take a break from the hustle and bustle. To him, these stories were just silly superstitions. Artyom, his grandmother warned him the first night, never look toward the forest at dawn, close the windows, and don't leave the house until the sun rises fully. Artyom grinned. Grandma, these are just fairy tales. I'm an adult. You can't scare me. Grandma looked at him anxiously, but did not answer anything. The next morning, when the first rays of the sun began to break through the trees, Artyom woke up to a strange sound. It was a faint rustle, as if someone was scrabbling at the window. He got out of bed and came closer. Something was moving behind the curtain. Artyom's heart froze, but curiosity took over. He carefully pulled back the fabric and looked outside. In the distance, at the very edge of the forest, stood figures. They were tall, unnaturally thin, with long arms that seemed too long for a human body. Their heads were slightly tilted, as if they were looking directly at him. Artyom felt a chill run down his back. He quickly pulled back the curtain, trying to convince himself that it was a play of light, but the sounds outside the window didn't stop. Suddenly he heard a quiet, almost whispering voice. "We see you." Artyom froze. The whisper outside the window was so quiet that he did not immediately realize whether it was reality or a figment of his imagination. He tried to convince himself that he just hadn't slept well, but his heart was racing. "It's the wind," he whispered under his breath, trying to calm himself. But the rustling increased. It sounded like scraping fingers, as if someone was running his fingernails over the glass. Artyom backed away from the window, trying not to make any noise. He glanced at his grandmother's room out of the corner of his eye. The door was closed. "I don't want to scare her. It's just some stupid prank," he thought. But deep down he realized that hardly anyone from the village is capable of such a thing. Unable to bear it, he slowly walked to the door and opened it cautiously to look out. It was quiet outside. Too quiet. Even the birds, which usually started chirping at dawn, were silent. Artyom stepped out onto the porch, wrapping his arms around himself from the morning cold. His gaze involuntarily drifted toward the forest. The figures he had seen before were closer now. They stood motionless like statues, and their heads were still tilted as if they were watching him. "Hey, who are you?" shouted Artyom, trying to give his voice confidence. There was no answer, only a slight breeze rustled in the grass. And suddenly one of the figures took a step forward. Her movements were abrupt, jerky, as if she were not used to walking. The others followed her. They moved slowly, but with each step they came closer to the house. Artyom felt his legs becoming absorbent cotton. He rushed back into the house and slammed the door shut. His heart was pounding so loudly that he barely heard the figures start banging on the windows and doors. "Grandma!" he shouted, bursting into her room. The old woman was already sitting on the bed, hugging an icon. Her face was deathly pale. "I warned you, Artyom. You should not have looked," she whispered. "Who is it? What do they want?" he asked, gasping with fear. "It's them. They come every morning to take away those who break the ban. We must wait. Don't open the door, no matter what happens." But the knocking grew stronger. Now it sounded everywhere, at the windows, at the walls, at the door. The house seemed to be surrounded. And suddenly everything went quiet. Artyom and grandmother froze, listening to the sepulchral silence. But this silence was even scarier. It was filled with something sinister, as if something lurked behind the walls. "Did they leave?" whispered Artyom. But at that moment the door began to open slowly, though he remembered exactly that he had locked it. On the threshold stood one of the figures. Her face was hidden by shadows, but Artyom could feel her gaze on him. "You're ours," whispered a voice that sounded both distant and close at the same time. Artyom froze in place, unable to move. The figure on the threshold was unreal. Its long, unnaturally thin arms stretched forward, and its face remained hidden in thick shadow. Only her eyes, two dim lights, burned in the darkness. "You are ours," the voice whispered again, this time closer and louder. "Grandmother," without wasting a second, grabbed Artyom's arm and pulled him sharply back into the depths of the room. She whispered something quickly, holding the icon in her hands, and closed the bedroom door. "What are you doing?" Artyom was frightened, but his grandmother answered firmly, "Be quiet and don't look them in the eye." A strange sound came from outside, a scraping sound, as if claws were scratching on wood. Then there was a heavy thud, as if something huge had thrown itself at the door. "They can't get in while we're in the house," Grandmother whispered, but her voice trembled. "The main thing is, don't open anything." Artyom wanted to say something, but suddenly noticed that the room became darker. The windows began to be covered with something that looked like a thick black fog. The light of the morning sun had disappeared, as if someone had swallowed it up. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to the window. Grandmother looked out there and turned pale. "That's their world. They are trying to take us there." Suddenly the fog began to seep in, oozing through the gaps in the windows and doors. Artyom felt the air become cold and heavy, and a low humming sounded in his ears. "Grandma, we have to do something," he shouted. "Pray, Artyom, that's the only thing that can stop them." But before he could utter a word, hands began to appear out of the mist. They were long, withered, with sharp claws. One of them reached out and grabbed Artyom's wrist. The cold burned his skin, and he felt his strength leaving him. "No!" the grandmother shouted and rushed to him. She struck his hand with the icon, and it disappeared with a hiss. But the fog continued to thicken, and the figures grew closer. Artyom felt that they would not retreat. "Grandmother, what do they want? Why are they coming?" he asked, trying not to look at the creature's eyes. Grandmother lowered her head. "It is an ancient curse. Anyone who looks at them becomes their prey. They feed on fear and souls." "How do we stop them?" Artyom felt that there was less and less time left. His grandmother looked at him, her eyes glistening with tears. "We have to wait until the sun rises fully, but it won't be easy." The knocking on the door became unbearably loud. It seemed as if the house was about to collapse. Artyom clenched his fists, trying to suppress fear. He realized that he had to fight, even if the chances were slim. And then he noticed an old book lying on the shelf. It looked ancient, with a shabby cover and strange symbols. "What's this?" he asked, pointing to it. Grandma looked at the book and turned even paler. It's not for your eyes." But Artyom had already grabbed it. He opened the first page and saw strange words written in a language he didn't understand. However, one word stood out. It seemed to burn on the page: the call. "This is our only chance," he said, feeling the cold hands closing in again. Artyom feverishly leafed through the pages of the ancient book, feeling the cold around him become unbearable. The shadows outside the door and windows whispered, calling his name. Their voices sounded both gentle and threatening, as if they knew his fears. "Artyom, stop!" shouted the grandmother, trying to snatch the book. "You don't realize what you're dealing with." But he couldn't stop anymore. Inside the book he found a strange pattern, a circle with rune-like symbols and text that seemed to come alive on the pages. One word repeated over and over again: "Call of Light." "Is that a spell?" he whispered, feeling a shiver run through his body. Grandmother nodded, but there was terror in her eyes. "Yes, but it's dangerous. If you do anything wrong, they'll take us both away. And if you do nothing, they'll take us anyway," Artyom replied, trying to suppress panic. He put the book on the table, took a piece of chalk and started drawing a circle with runes on the floor. Following the instructions, his hands trembled, but he continued. Meanwhile, the mist filled almost the entire room, and figures began to emerge through it. They were closer than ever. "Hurry!" shouted Grandmother, clutching the icon to her chest. When the circle was complete, Artyom stood in its center, holding a book in front of him. It said that in order to activate it, one had to say the words to the light. "Don't be afraid, just read," shouted his grandmother. Artyom began to read. His voice trembled, but the words he spoke seemed to fill the room with warmth. "Lux Eterna, Sancta Lumina, Expel Light Tenebris," he shouted, repeating the lines. The figures hissed as if burned. They began to retreat, but suddenly one of them rushed forward, its clawed hand breaking through the circle. "Artyom, don't stop," shouted the grandmother, rushing towards the figure with the icon. He continued reading despite his fear. Light began to fill the room, breaking through the fog. The sun itself seemed to invade the house, destroying everything dark. The figures screamed. Their screams were unbearable, but after a moment they disappeared. leaving only thick black smoke. Artyom fell to his knees, barely breathing. The room was filled with morning light again, and his grandmother sank down beside him. "You did it," she whispered, hugging him. But the joy didn't last long. Artyom looked at the book, and his heart squeezed. On the last page there was a new inscription: "The light has protected you today, but the darkness will return." He realized that this was only the beginning. After the light dispelled the darkness, the house was filled with silence. Artyom and Grandma sat on the floor, unable to move. Their hearts were mixed with relief and anxiety. But Artyom could not take his eyes off the book. The last words on its pages, as if scorched by fire, gave him no rest. "The darkness will return." "Grandma, what does that mean?" he asked, pointing to the inscription. "Why will they come again?" The old woman rose slowly, her hand still trembling. "Artyom, you have awakened something ancient. These creatures are not just spirits. They are connected to this place, to the forest. They can't be destroyed, only driven away for a while. But how can we prepare?" Artyom felt that time was short. Grandmother went to an old chest in the corner of the room. She opened it, pulling out a shabby bundle. Unfolding the cloth, she showed Artyom an ancient amulet, a circle of ebony with carved symbols similar to those in the book. "This is a guardian. It protects the house, but only if its power hasn't run out." She looked at the amulet, then at Artyom. "But to activate it, a sacrifice must be made." "What kind of sacrifice?" Artyom frowned, feeling cold fear clutching his heart. "The forest requires a soul." The grandmother lowered her head. "That's why we never break the rules. Those who look up to them pay the price of their lives to protect the others." Artyom fell silent. His thoughts were getting confused. He remembered how he had looked at the shadows the first time, and how things were different now. "So now they want me?" he asked quietly. Grandmother nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Yes, but as long as you're here, protected by the house, they can't take you away." "And if I leave?" Artyom looked up. "No," answered the grandmother sharply. "That's not the way out. We must find another way." But there was no other way. Night. As the sun began to set, Artyom felt the tension in the house increase. The shadows in the corners became deeper, and the wind outside the windows howled as if something evil was whispering his name. Grandmother prepared the house for the night. She lit candles, placed the amulet in the center of the table, and drew protective circles with chalk around the doors and windows. "It won't keep them away for long," she said, looking at Artyom, "but it will give us time." The night was long. The silence outside the windows seemed ominous, but at some point Artyom heard a familiar sound, a rustle, as if someone were scraping on the glass. "They're here," whispered his grandmother, hugging the icon. Artyom went to the window, trying not to look outside, but the rustling grew louder, and then there was a knock at the door. "Open up," came a voice, low and long. "You can't hide forever." Artyom closed his eyes, trying not to give in to fear, but the voice continued. "We know you're here. We can see you." Grandmother began to recite prayers, and Artyom looked at the amulet. He realized that there was less and less time left. "Grandma," he said, his voice trembling, but there was determination in it. "I must go." "No," she screamed. "This is not the way out." But Artyom already knew that he could not stay. These creatures would not back down until they got what they wanted. He took the amulet, hung it around his neck, and went to the door. "Artyom, please don't do this." Grandma tried to stop him, but he gently pulled her away. "I won't let them take you away, Grandma," he said, opening the door. Outside, a thick fog met him, and the shadows stood like statues, waiting. "I'm here," Artyom said, looking at them, "but you're not taking my family." The figures began to move, surrounding him. Their eyes glowed with an ominous light. Suddenly, the amulet around his neck began to pulse. A bright light erupted from it, blinding the shadows. They howled, retreating, but one of them lunged forward. Artyom closed his eyes as the figure lunged at him. He expected to feel the cold of its claws or hear a whisper, but instead a blinding light enveloped his body. The amulet around his neck glowed as if a fire had ignited in it. The figure stopped a few feet away from him, howling in pain. Its silhouette trembled, as if melting under the bright light. The other shadows began to retreat as well, hiding in the thick fog. "This is not the end," one of them whispered, her voice sounding like a peal of thunder. "We'll be back." The light from the amulet intensified, and the shadows vanished as if they had never existed. The fog cleared, and Artyom saw that he was standing on the threshold of the house. It was quiet around him. Only the first rays of dawn were breaking through the trees. He fell to his knees, barely breathing. Their voices still echoed in his head. "Artyom," Grandma ran out of the house, hugging him. "You're alive." He looked at her, but there was anxiety in his eyes. "They said they'd be back," he whispered. An ancient secret. When Artyom came to his senses, his grandmother sat him down at the table. On it lay the amulet, now cold and tarnished. "You activated it," she said, scrutinizing the ancient artifact. "But its power is temporary. They will indeed return." "Why are they connected to this place?" Artyom asked, still trying to understand what had happened. Grandma sighed. "It's a long story. Once upon a time, there were people who lived in this forest who worshipped darkness. They made sacrifices to gain power and protection. But one day their greed became too great, and they upset the balance. The forest became cursed and the darkness took shape. And now they come after those who disturb their peace," Artyom clarified. "Yes, they take those who look at them, who dare to challenge their power. So it's my fault," he said, lowering his head. "No, Artyom." His grandmother put her hand on his shoulder. "You didn't know, but now you are connected to this forest." Artyom realized that he couldn't just sit and wait. He decided that he had to find a way to break the connection with the darkness once and for all. "We must find the source of their power," he said. "What keeps them in this world?" Grandmother thought for a moment, then nodded. "There is a place in the forest that the old men have always called the Heart of Darkness. No one knows exactly where it is, but they say it's where all evil begins." "Then I must go there," Artyom said firmly. "It's dangerous," objected Grandmother. "You might not come back. If I don't try, they will still come after me, and then for you and the others." Grandmother was silent for a long time, and then she took another thing out of the chest, an old compass with an emerald arrow. "This will help you. It will show you the way to the Heart of Darkness. But be careful, Artyom. The forest never lets go of those who go too far." At dawn, Artyom set off into the forest. The compass led him along narrow paths that became less and less visible. The trees around him thickened, their branches reaching for him like claws. The air grew colder and colder, and the silence was oppressive. Artyom felt that someone was watching him, but every time he turned around, he saw only shadows. A few hours into the journey, he came to a clearing. In its center stood an ancient stone altar covered with the symbols he had seen in the book. The compass stopped moving. It was pointing straight at the altar. "This is the Heart of Darkness," Artyom whispered, coming closer. But as soon as he took a step, the ground beneath his feet trembled. Figures began to emerge from the shadows of the trees. They were bigger and scarier than the ones that had come to the house. "You shouldn't be here," said a low voice that echoed across the clearing. Artyom clutched the amulet around his neck and took a step forward. "I have come to put an end to this," he said, his voice firm despite his fear. The figures began to surround him, but he knew there was no turning back. Artyom stood before an ancient altar, surrounded by figures that seemed to be the embodiment of darkness itself. Their eyes, like coals of fire, stared at him intently, and their voices merged into an ominous whisper. "You shouldn't have come here, mortal," one of them said, his voice low and vibrating, as if it came from the earth itself. Artyom clutched the amulet around his neck. He felt a faint warmth emanating from it, but his strength had clearly weakened after the last fight. "I have come to put an end to your curse," he said firmly, though inside everything was shrinking with fear. The figures laughed, their laughter sounding like the gnashing of iron. "You think you can defeat us? We are the darkness that was here long before your kind. We are indestructible." Artyom looked at the altar covered in ancient symbols. He knew that the key to victory was here, but he didn't understand how to use it. Suddenly, the compass he held in his hand began to glow. The emerald arrow trembled and then pointed directly at the center of the altar. Artyom moved closer and noticed that in the center was carved a round recessed mark, perfectly matching the shape of his amulet. "This is it," he whispered, raising his hand to his neck. But as soon as he removed the amulet, the figures rushed toward him sharply. Their clawed hands reached out to stop him. "Don't you dare!" they shouted in unison. Artyom barely managed to bounce away, but one of the figures grabbed his arm. The cold burned his skin, and he felt the strength begin to leave his body. "Let go," he shouted, hitting the figure with the amulet as hard as he could. The creature howled and retreated, and Artyom, wasting no time, inserted the amulet into the center of the altar. As soon as the amulet was in its place, the altar began to vibrate. A bright light burst out of it, so dazzling that Artyom closed his eyes. The light spilled across the clearing, penetrating every shadow, every corner of the forest. The figures began to scream. Their bodies cracked, turning into black smoke that vanished into thin air. "No, you don't realize what you're doing," shouted one of them before dissolving. The light grew brighter and brighter until it filled the entire forest. Artyom felt the warmth enveloping him, and for a moment he thought he heard voices, the voices of those who had been taken by the darkness. "Thank you," someone whispered, and then everything went quiet. When Artyom opened his eyes, he was standing in a clearing, but the altar had disappeared. The forest no longer seemed ominous. The sun was rising above the horizon, its warm rays illuminating the earth. Artyom looked at his hands. The amulet had also disappeared, leaving only a faint trace on his neck. He realized that the darkness would not return again. Returning home, he felt light, as if he had thrown off a huge weight. His grandmother met him on the doorstep, her eyes filled with tears when she saw him alive. "You did it," she said, hugging him. "You set us free." But Artyom knew that this experience would stay with him forever. The forest was no longer cursed, but it would forever be a place where light had conquered darkness. Artyom sat on the porch of his grandmother's house, looking out at the dawn. The forest, which had seemed threatening before, now looked peaceful. The darkness was gone, but the memories of what he had experienced remained forever. Grandmother came and sat next to him, holding a cup of hot tea. "The forest is no longer whispering. Do you hear it?" she said with a smile. Artyom nodded. The silence of the forest was now peaceful, not ominous. "I don't know how I did it," he admitted, looking at his hands, "but I feel that I have done something important. You have freed not only yourself, but all of us," Grandmother replied. "These creatures will not come back." Artyom thought about the words he had heard when the light swallowed the shadows. The voices of the taken souls who had thanked him still echoed in his head. He knew that he had become part of something bigger, and that his deed had left a mark not only in this world, but also in the other. A new day. The sun rose high above the village, filling it with warmth and light. The villagers, who had previously been afraid to leave their homes before full dawn, now walked boldly through the streets. "You're a hero, Artyom," said his grandmother, touching him on the shoulder. He shook his head. "No, grandmother, I just did what I had to do." But deep down, he knew he had become a different person. The darkness no longer frightened him, because he had faced it and conquered it. So ended the story of an ancient curse and the courage of one man who dared to confront the unknown. The forest remained quiet and peaceful, and the village regained its peace. But somewhere deep inside, Artyom knew light and darkness will always fight, and sometimes all it takes is one person to change everything.